Thank you, Rula and Melinda. Such an interesting conversation, recorded, of course, a few days ago before yesterday's announcement that Melinda and Bill Gates are to divorce. One of the things I picked up there very clearly was Melinda Gates's strong desire for the international community to see the moral value of distributing vaccines more widely. Of course, she's very wedded to, and interestingly echoed yesterday in a conversation Anthony Fauci had with the FT, the US vaccines expert, about the need to leave aside this potential trade battle over intellectual property while the pandemic is raging. He, like Melinda Gates, believes that it's not the moment to have that particular fight. Now, I'm particularly looking forward to our next session. It's Managing the Pandemic, moderated by the FT's Science Editor Clive Cookson. The arrival of vaccines seemed to bring the end of the pandemic closer, yet many uncertainties remain. There's the changing nature of the virus itself, vaccine hesitancy, the supply chain challenges that have strengthened vaccine nationalism with negative effects for emerging markets. Is an effective global vaccine rollout a pipe dream? Should we get used to living with the virus rather than eradicating it? To address these questions, we have a fantastic lineup of guests. Ugur Sahin joins us. He's the co-founder and CEO of BioNTech, which partnered with Pfizer to develop one of the first vaccines against COVID in record time. We also welcome Seth Berkley. Seth is Chief Executive of Gavi. The Vaccine Alliance is co-leading COVAX, the initiative to ensure global equitable access to COVID vaccines, the topic that Rula and Melinda talked about in the last session. Kate Bingham is on our panel. She's the venture capitalist who, as the first head of the UK Vaccine Task Force, spearheaded one of the most successful vaccine rollouts we've seen. And finally, Martin Lush. Martin is from Global Boardroom partner NSF International's Global Health Sciences division. OK, that's the lineup for our first panel of the day. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome also to FT audiences who join us for this session from ft.com and from LinkedIn. And remember, regardless of how you're joining us, you can pose your own questions to our speakers via the box on the right of your screen. And the hashtag for your online contributions is FT Global Boardroom. Your moderator, Clive Cookson, joins you next.
NSF started as an ambitious idea. Over the last 75 years, thousands of dedicated public health professionals, scientists, and leaders have built upon that original idea and, in fact, expanded upon it.
We've been very busy these days with clients trying to get their products to the market for the coronavirus.
We are actively engaged to keep high the NSF flag.
I'm going to introduce you to the Scrub Club way. First, you get a handful of water.
At NSF International, we will always be their partner in public health and safety, especially in this time of global pandemic.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. Many thanks for joining us for the second session of the FT Global Boardroom. I'm Clive Cookson, FT Science Editor, and for our topic, Managing the Pandemic, Looking Beyond an Effective Vaccine Rollout, we have four superb panelists, and I think they've already been introduced by my colleague Andrew in the studio. So I'll move straight into our discussion, for which I have planned out several sections. We'll look first at what's happening now with COVID vaccines and what looks like a bipolar split as the pandemic begins to wane in the wealthier world with the rollout of vaccines, while terrible things are happening in poorer regions, particularly in South Asia and South America. Then we'll look into the future of this pandemic, and then we'll go on to examine the implications beyond COVID. Finally, we have 10 minutes or so to answer questions from all of you in the audience. So do please submit your questions via the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can share thoughts about what we're saying on social media using the hashtag Global Boardroom, FT Global Boardroom. But as I've told my independent-minded panelists, our actual discussion may take a different turn over the next 45 minutes. The best conference sessions are spontaneous and they involve improvisation. But Kate, I'm going to start with you. Please tell us, to set the scene, how you think the COVID vaccines rollout has been going so far.
Thanks, Clive. So I think it has been a phenomenal success story of collaboration and scientific achievement. So in the last 4 months, over 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines have been given. And that's within 16 months of identifying this novel virus. And so we have different vaccines, different formats of vaccines. They're manufactured all over the world. So a little over 7% of the world's population now have received at least one dose. So I think that's incredibly positive success. The UK obviously is well on track with its vaccination program. It's got the lowest COVID rate now of the G7, and we're seeing real world evidence correlate with the clinical trial data that was generated. And we've just seen data showing drop in transmission too, which is incredibly helpful. But as you point out in the introduction, the issues are that 31% of the vaccines that have been administered have gone to the States, and under 2% have gone to Africa. Airfinity, which is a wonderful company that pulls together lots of data, suggests that we've got over 700 million doses that are excess in 2021 from the EU, UK, US, Japan, and Canada, assuming just an adult-only vaccination. And of course, that would massively speed up the rate of global vaccination should we allow those vaccines to get released. And I think the other big issue that we've got to recognize is that non-COVID disease is now starting to hit hospitals. So people that didn't go to see their GPs are now getting diagnosed with very serious illnesses. So I think there's some serious issues that we need to address.
Thank you, Kate. That was a great setting the scene opener. Ugur, as CEO of one of the companies at the heart of the world's vaccination effort, how are you finding it? How happy are you with the way things are going for BioNTech?
Yeah, thanks, Clive. So we are, of course, happy that we can contribute to this vaccine supply. We managed to expand our manufacturing. Our plan was to deliver 1.3 billion doses in 2021. And our teams did a great job to further increase the manufacturing scale to come up now with numbers reaching 3 billion doses. And we see that we are producing timely. We are happy that we are not facing too many technical problems and can keep our delivery schedules. And of course, we are happy to see the real world data that show that the vaccinations really make an impact on individual people's life, but also make an impact in starting to see a reduction of infections, reduction of severe hospitalization, and reduction of deaths. And this is encouraging and feels good.
Excellent. Seth, I'm going to ask you next. We've heard a lot about vaccine nationalism, and some of the people in the audience might have heard Melinda Gates talking about it with the FT editor, Rula Khalaf, a few minutes ago in the opening session. How do you think that the vaccine-rich countries can balance their commitments to immunize their own populations against their more altruistic global responsibilities? How can we set that balance?
So first of all, I want to say how delighted I am to be here with this august panel, all of whom are working on these important issues. When we originally set up COVAX, we were trying to avoid what happened in 2009, where a small number of countries bought up all of the doses for swine flu, and there were no doses for the rest of the world. And we really wanted two things. We wanted equity to be key on the agenda, and we also wanted to make sure we could reduce bilateral deals, because that's not the best way of distributing vaccines globally. It is a global pandemic, and we will not get back to normal until we deal with the problem globally. And obviously, we've seen this now very loudly with variants. So that's really the challenge that's in front of us. And, the challenge we have now, we've proven that the concept works. We've delivered to, in a relatively short period of time, 121 countries, more than 50 million doses of vaccines, but we don't have doses right now. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we heavily invested in Indian vaccine manufacturers, because that's where the largest production of vaccines actually is by volume in the world. And they were critical to trying to roll out vaccines. And of course, given the situation that's gone on, you mentioned at the beginning, it is a challenge. They have not allowed exporting of their doses. But the other thing that's happened is there have been locked up doses for many countries that has meant there haven't been volumes. So what we're trying to do right now is to use what Kate talked about, which is some dose sharing to try to fill in this hole. Now, COVAX has procured more than 2 billion doses, and they will be coming. But of course, there's an acute need right now. And we've been very pleased to see France, New Zealand, Sweden, Spain, all step up and talk about and make doses available now. We think this is critical because we have to get at least health workers and high-risk groups vaccinated around the world. And this is a real global challenge. We understand, of course, the balance that countries need to do in terms of trying to take care of their own populations, but we also need to make sure we can dampen down this pandemic globally if we're to have any hope of returning to some type of normality.
Martin, I'm going to ask you to pick up on what Seth was talking about and sort of say more specifically, what impact do you think the sort of current COVID catastrophes in India and South America will have on the global vaccine problems?
I think, Clive, what we're seeing in India in particular, in my mind, changes absolutely everything. I think, firstly, it's a cautionary reminder to the rest of the world. Number one, the importance of lockdown. You cannot vaccinate your way through this in isolation. Number two, don't relax too soon, too fast. And thirdly, and importantly, it's a reminder that no one is safe until we are all safe. Now, putting aside the human catastrophe in India in particular, obviously the risks of new variants that could undermine global vaccination efforts. Secondly, and Seth has already reminded us of this, that India is the largest supplier of vaccines. 87% of Seth's vaccines will be coming or should be coming from the State Serum Institute. So we're going to have supply chain issues with vaccines because they're going to rededicate supply to their own domestic use. And also importantly, India also supplies the vast majority of non-COVID related vaccines. So we've got to remind ourselves that there are other vaccination programs that are equally important in many cases. And lastly, India is the largest, this is non-vaccine related, it's the largest supplier of generic medicines. 1 in 3 medicines consumed in the US comes from an Indian generic manufacturer. So we can expect supply chain challenges and issues beyond COVID as a result of what we're seeing in India. So it does change everything. And I really believe that those countries like the UK that have high vaccination rates, low rates of infection, really need to turn their focus on India. Those excess vaccines that Kate was referring to need to be given to Seth immediately so that there can be, I think we need to go on a war footing with India. We need a surge vaccination campaign immediately. I think we need to scale down domestic programs where those programs are in environments in control. And I think there needs to be a very coordinated surge campaign in India where we're offering not just vaccines, but we're actually we're offering logistic support, infrastructure support to get on top of this. And bearing in mind, this will also be replicated in South America, also replicated in Africa. So once we've helped India, we then need to refocus our efforts on other regions. And finally, I think it causes certainly global pharma to rethink their supply chains. Those supply chains are vulnerable. Vast majority of medicines come from India and China. Is that a vulnerability that we want to continue with? I don't think so. So for me, it changes everything.
Thank you, Martin. That was very powerful stuff. It does change everything. Kate, I'm going to move slightly forward and pick up on what Martin was talking about, supply chains. I mean, how do you see the supply chain for coronavirus vaccines and indeed other medicines developing around the world in the sort of short to medium term? I mean,
So, I mean, I agree with Martin. I think this pandemic has shone a spotlight on the inadequacies of a lot of the supply chain. I completely agree we need to avoid nationalism because that doesn't help anybody or anything. And actually, these supply chains are global. They are interdisciplinary and they require multiple countries to produce the various different inputs. So no single country can provide everything that's needed, and we aren't interdependent. So what I think is very clear is we need to build flexible and scalable manufacturing facilities around the world, and especially and this you may disagree with, in countries with small populations, because where we need to get to is where the countries in question can already supply their own population, because there is always going to be that tension between supplying their own population versus going abroad. And something we did in the UK was to start a market engagement process to build a new 24,000 litre bioprocessing flexible manufacturing capability in the UK beyond what we've got already. So we've now got in the UK capability to supply the UK population more than once over with the flexibility of the different plants we put in place. But we need to go beyond that, because actually we can do, the UK is good at this, and we should be able to leverage those skills and leverage the fact that we've been able to do the clinical trials quickly and actually the scale up quickly. And we need to do it in such a way that these plants are financially sustainable. So they're not sort of waiting idle until the next pandemic shows up. They need to be commercially used full time with a workforce that is skilled and infrastructure. And we also need, and we'll get onto this, better vaccine formats. But it's both the manufacturing of drug substance, and it needs to be flexible, because we don't know. mRNA looking fantastic now, but it may be that future viruses will require different formats. So we need to have that capability that they are flexible and they can pivot to whichever format is going to be most needed for the next pandemic.
Ugo, let's stick with the supply chain issue, because I think it's so important. From your perspective, working with Pfizer, how do you think the global supply chain for vaccines, particularly mRNA vaccines, can be strengthened and improved?
Yeah, I see different phases of development. We are now in the phase of reacting to a pandemic in a situation where actually the world was not prepared to react. And I fully agree with Kate, and that the international collaboration resulted in an outstanding response. After such a short time, accomplishing to deliver up to 1 billion vaccine doses is incredible. And we are still in this reactive situation. So we are still trying to produce and scale up our manufacturing. As already mentioned, we were successful in scaling up our manufacturing, but we can now start to think about what can we do in the next phase. Yeah. So how can we ensure a supply in 2022, 2023? I believe we all understand that the virus will stay with us, yeah, and that most likely some sort of revaccination is needed. And we all agree that we are only safe if everyone is safe. Yeah. So one of the tasks must be really to ensure that we can also develop vaccines against variant strains. And the first generation of variants that we are seeing at the moment might not be the worst one, and it is quite possible that we have to deal, once we have more immunity worldwide, that we have to deal even with more complicated variants. We need to prepare ourselves, and here we have the chance not to be any more reactive but proactive. Yeah, and there are different models to be proactive, and one model is the model that Kate has described, to build manufacturing factories, yeah, even in smaller states, and enable that they can produce by themselves. the challenge here is to ensure that we have a consistent quality. Yeah, that this is really regardless in which factory a vaccine is produced, that we can ensure it's the same quality. So that type of plan requires really quality assurance systems and protocol sharing systems and consistent evaluation of these factories, whether they stick to the quality demands. The other is to expand certain sites to ensure that the sites can produce several billion doses a year. Yeah, and I believe if we have a mixed solution, yeah, on the one side, this specialized small factories, on the other side, really huge factories, yeah, and then the combination of both could give us really the flexibility to react to any situation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Seth to pick up on the points that you've made, Ugur, and what Kate said before. I mean, assuming that, as Ugur says, COVID is going to remain with us as an endemic disease, which is serious enough to require repeated vaccinations, at least over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. How can the world organize and pay for this once we move out of the sort of most acute phase of the pandemic?
So let me build on what my colleague said first, and then I'll answer the question. And you know, for me, we also have to talk about the supply of specialized parts and tools and equipment that is needed for vaccine production. So it's funny, Kate talked about 24,000 liters in the UK. We have 24,000 liters of a facility, of a set of facilities that are ready to go with a vaccine, but they can't get and produce vaccines because they can't get some filters that are required that are being produced in another country. And our supply chains are completely interlinked. So the idea that one puts in export controls to protect your domestic companies then has an effect globally that may not be what you've expected, but you know, can have a dramatic effect. So we really have to rethink this and be available. And by the way, that when people ask me to I think Kate's point, or maybe it was Ugur's point, we'd love to have the SII in Singapore, where you know the first test run of the vaccine could saturate all the citizens, and then there's no challenge in exporting. But to your question, Clive, the problem right now is we don't know enough about the science to really answer that. Is this a straight linear increase in vaccination? Will we need booster doses because of waning immunity for high-risk groups? Or will we need to change the vaccine for variants, or even have specialized variant boosters? And it's likely to be some combination of those scenarios. And so what we need to do is be flexible in our planning. But the point is, this is not something that's going away now. So we're going to have to rethink of this going forward. I agree completely with the idea that we need to diversify manufacturing, and even agree more about the sustainability of those investments. As the largest purchaser of vaccines in the world, we would welcome more plans coming online that could do a balance of global vaccines, but also regionally necessary vaccines, which we have in all regions. There are vaccines that are really specifically used in those regions. And then lastly, we have to have a combination of both. Right now, for the low-income countries, we're doing donor finance, but there's many innovative financing mechanisms that can help. I mean, we can use things like development banks, but recently IFM has been a really important innovation. That's something that was originally started by then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown. It uses capital markets to bring money forth from long-term contributions. And what's nice about that is you can make a 20-year contribution or a commitment, 20-year commitment, and you can front load that money. And in a pandemic, that's perfect because many balance sheets don't have the money in it to pay for the surge that we have right now. And this is a way to, in essence, even it out over time. And in fact, for example, Sweden, as their payment, the UK and others have used this instrument to be able to help globally at the same time while they spread those payments out. And because we also don't want to hurt existing programs, particularly vaccination, because if we do slow down vaccines to prevent COVID's death, for every death we prevent, we have 84 deaths from other vaccine preventable diseases. This would not be a good outcome.
No, it certainly wouldn't. I'm going to turn back briefly to the science for Ugur, but I wanted to ask Martin to sort of round off our talk about vaccine manufacturing, supplies, financing. I mean, what's your reaction to the three, your three fellow panelists' views on expanding globally, flexibly?
I completely agree, Clive, with what the other speakers have said. And I think it's important that as we go through this process, we learn from what we've done and where we're going, because we do have so much to learn. And interestingly, Norway and Sweden have started their own investigations, if you like, in terms of lessons learned. Because I think what we need to remind ourselves is that COVID globally is in ascendancy. And, you know, so that review of what we can do better going forward from a global perspective is some way off. But I do think, to your point, Clive, that it's really important that we move forward and do better. So the lessons learned has to start straight away. But the scope of that really needs to be very local, because our primary objective is how do we manage the next wave better. So for me, key questions around, for example, why were the Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities greatest affected? What are we going to do differently? You know, the 30,000 deaths in care homes plus 900 in the NHS. What are we going to do differently? How do we fix the disconnect between the NHS and social care? What have we learnt from wasting vast sums of public money on ineffective privatized track and trace systems? You know, was our policy on school closures correct? Is our policy, back to Kate's point, around things like non-elective surgery that was postponed in the NHS? Do we need to revisit that? So for me, moving forward, we need to make sure, I think Henry Ford's quote, you know, mistake is an opportunity to start again, but only more intelligently, I think is very valid, so that as we learn from what we've done in both supply chain, in distribution, for that next wave, we actually do it a whole lot better.
And that you've raised another issue, which is if we are going to learn from this, we're going to have in countries, individual countries, and in global organizations, inquiries, investigations, looking back, and it's already controversial in the UK about whether it should happen now, whether that would be a terrible distraction from the immediate fight against the pandemic. I'm going to come back to new variants, etc., but let's just stick with that for a moment. Kate, what's your thoughts about how a really effective investigation, inquiry, can be organized to learn the most from what we've done right and what we've done wrong with COVID so far?
Well, that is a political question, Clive, and my expertise is much more about what can we do better rather than look back in the past. I mean, I think actually, as far as vaccines has been concerned, I think it's been a pretty strong collaborative story across the world. As Seth says, it's not been good enough, and we need to make it better. And I think one of the things that we can learn now is that these vaccines are difficult to manufacture, they're costly to deploy, and we're not getting them to the people that need them. So that tells us that we need to do something about the actual vaccine formulation themselves. So what we know is the 4 different kinds of vaccines, so adeno, mRNA, adjuvanted protein, and whole viral-based vaccines, all in different ways are pretty effective and safe, but they're not easy to deploy and they're expensive. So what we should be doing now is investing in revised and improved formulations to make them stable, to provide formats that can be delivered to northern Nigeria and around the world. So whether they're patches or sprays or oral tablets, whatever they can be, that's what we should be learning. That trying to scale up these complicated processes into cold chains and complex delivery processes, that is not acceptable for a rapid response. So that is my area. I mean, of course, there's lots more, as Martin says, that needs to be learned. But as far as I'm concerned, that's the main learning for me, which is we've made the first step, which is providing these or generating these incredibly effective vaccines far beyond what anyone expected. But we now need to improve the actual formulation and the delivery to make it cheaper and easier to deploy.
That will obviously lead on to Ugur. How can we improve the formulation and delivery of these vaccines? I mean, can you imagine an mRNA vaccine but being delivered orally or transdermally? How would you see the routes to make them cheaper, easier to transport, less dependent on cold chains?
Yeah, we are working on that. Our first formulation had to be stored and shipped at -80 degrees. We have now, in the meantime, a formulation which is not yet approved, so we are preparing the data packages which can be stored at 2 to 8 degrees, and we will most likely reach 6 months stability at 2 to 8 degrees. So that is really providing now a solution for transportation of this vaccines in a reliable manner, and that should not be the limitation. And what I also expect is, of course, with the increasing scale and efficacy of production, the cost of goods will go down because increase of scale means, of course, increase of scale of raw materials, improved manufacturing processes, not only on the mRNA vaccine side, but also improved manufacturing processes for all materials. And we will get an mRNA industry into place. So that will be an industrial revolution, yeah, which will, of course, make drop costs down. So when I compare that with for example, antibody-based innovations, the starting amounts for antibodies was about 200 milligram per liter. Now companies can reach 10 gram per liter or even more. So we will have improvement. Yeah, I'm really confident. The second thing is even more important. Yeah, is we have seen the economic cost of this pandemic. Yeah? And of course, all the experts knew that such a pandemic could happen. So it is not a complete surprise. There were plans available. Yeah, there was this demands for making, creating manufacturing and response systems, and it was not invested. Yeah, so we have to. It was a decision. Yeah, a political or public decision or no decision to invest. Yeah, and now we now know that these things can change our life and can change the fate of the whole planet, and we need to invest. That's the first decision that we have to do. Yeah, we should not talk too much about cost. Yeah, because the costs that are needed to be invested are only a minimal fraction of the cost that we have with the pandemic. Yeah. So the very clear message is pay now or pay later. Yeah. So it is, at the end of the day, we really need to have an understanding that we have to invest. We have to invest into vaccines, not only in the industrial world. We have to invest into into supplying vaccines for low-income countries. And this is a decision to be made. Yeah? Otherwise, we will continue to argue, oh, this is expensive and this cannot be done. The first thing is invest.
Thank you. I'm going to take that on to Seth and then Martin. So broadening that out and moving beyond COVID, I mean, how would you advocate strengthening the world's health systems and making them more resilient to future pandemics? Because if COVID was disease X, there's going to be a disease Y sooner or later, isn't there?
So first of all, I love the answers of my two fellow panelists on this. I did a TED Talk actually in 2015. Bill Gates did a TED Talk. He's famous for having predicted this. I did the back-to-back TED Talk talking about the investments in vaccines, the importance of them, how we could prepare, how we could bring new technologies. And I agree completely with what Ugur just said in terms of that. But I want to make an important point. Kate laid out these very important ideas. One of our priorities, for example, is to work on patch technology as a way to use vaccines in campaigns, et cetera. But I don't want her to leave the impression with people that we can't deliver vaccines now. At -80, we were able to deliver Ebola vaccines in war zones. Now, it is expensive, it is difficult. And that's why getting to 2.8 to 2 to 8, as Ugur has talked about, or even -20 is a big step forward. But we deliver billions of doses in the most difficult places in the world. There is a cold chain. So the point is if we can get products that can fit in the existing cold chain, we can get those out to populations. And therefore, we need to do that now. These new technologies are important, but they may be in the future. Now, to your question, Clive, the critical issue is having resilient health systems. What's interesting about vaccines, today vaccines with routine vaccination reach about 90% of the families in the world. So there's still 10% that do not get a routine vaccine, the so-called zero dose. And that's a really important group because 50% of those groups are below the poverty line. That's where the deaths are concentrated. And so our core strategy, not our COVID strategy, our core strategy is to really focus in on those zero-dose communities, build out that health system. And of course, they have multiple problems there. So it's not just vaccines, it's maternal mortality, it's malaria, it's other issues. So how do we bundle and work in building that? And lastly, what's important about building out to these communities is that is the warning system. The reason we had the 2015 Ebola epidemic so badly is because it occurred in an area without a health system. They didn't diagnose it for months. And by the time they diagnosed it, it had moved into cities, it had moved into multiple countries, and that's what led to the pandemic. So building resilient health systems is a way to get tools out, but also to be able to diagnose outbreaks when they occur. And that's what the world needs. I like what Ugur said, pay now or pay later, because ultimately it is evolutionarily certain we will continue to have outbreaks. In some sense, we're lucky the mortality rate for this was 2%. The last two coronavirus that popped into humans had much higher mortality rates, and we don't know what the next one is going to bring. So we have to get better prepared.
So, Martin, everyone's been saying, most recently Seth just now, that another pandemic is inevitable. But I think you think, even if it's inevitable, we can certainly do a lot to prevent it happening sooner. In other words, to reduce the chances of the next pandemic. But perhaps you could say a word about prevention before I take one or two audience questions.
I think, Clive, rightfully so, the kind of focal point for this discussion has been on vaccination treatment, because we're in that reactionary phase. But very quickly, we need to be shifting to prevention, because I truly believe that outbreaks, whether they be viral or microbial, are inevitable, but pandemics are optional. There are many thousands of viruses and microbes with pandemic potential, and the contributing factors of global warming, deforestation, animals coming into closer contact with urban populations, with unregulated wet markets. The list of those contributing factors is long, and each one of those remains. So the cost of prevention is minimal versus treatment. We're already experiencing that. So we need to really shift to, investment, as Seth said, in those robust local healthcare systems. What I find interesting is that a lot of countries are talking about investing in their own healthcare systems for the next pandemic. What we need to be doing is shifting that investment into those regions where the focal points of those pandemics are of higher probability, so that we can detect early, contain early, share information fast with complete transparency, so that we can actually prevent rather than be in the reactionary treatment mode. I love Louis Pasteur's quote, which said, microbes always have the last word. What we've shown in this pandemic is that science has, with Uger's group and others, has demonstrated what we can achieve, so that if we can then shift our focus to prevention, we can actually prove Louis Pasteur wrong.
Let's hope we can. I've had a lot of questions, and I'm afraid I'm only going to take one or two of them. This is a quite slightly provocative one. Let's direct it at Kate. Would it not make more sense to focus on cures and treatments rather than vaccines? We could then save more people and avoid potential long-term effects of these experimental vaccines. That's someone who seems, I wouldn't say, I don't know, he or she hasn't put their name.
So I think that's a great question.
Yes.
I think it's a great question, and it's especially relevant now because we've got such widespread diagnostic testing. So if you think about the fact now, one of the reasons antivirals doesn't work is by the time you actually get symptoms severe enough to want to do something about it, the virus, you're well infected with the virus. But if you could get very early notice that you have been infected through routine and widespread diagnostic testing, then I think the prospect of antivirals becomes, as in using drugs to actually halt the progression and of the disease, becomes much more realistic. So yes, I do think we need to invest hard in antivirals. And again, frankly, globally, we have all underperformed on this. I mean, it's clearly vaccines was a very successful global collaboration. Antivirals has not been a successful global collaboration. We haven't made as much progress developing new drugs against this disease. We, again, in the UK, have put things in place to enable that. So, the fact we've now developed human challenge studies, so these studies where you deliberately infect young, healthy volunteers, that allows you to really tease out the biology of infection. So you can test people before and after infection, and obviously then test the efficacy of drugs. But I do think we need to improve antivirals, and whoever asked the question, keep banging that drum, because I think it's really important.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question on a different topic, because you answered that one very nicely, Kate. This is coming from LinkedIn Live. We need to be thinking more about global governance. What are your thoughts about governance? And I would say in particular the role of the WHO. Martin, why don't you take that one?
I think the WHO have come under a lot of criticism, as a result of this. And I think a lot of that is unfair. I do think that we need to firstly fund the WHO to do its job properly. And I think we need to really think long and hard about its terms of reference, so that it actually has more authority to kickstart the world into action when and if the next pandemic arrives. So I think the WHO has played an important part, will continue to play an important part, but we need to rethink, modernize, and reinvest to enable it to do its job properly.
And there's a related question. Maybe this one will be for Seth. What do you think about the idea of having a global mega vaccine center that will coordinate and do R&D and development as well as ensuring some equity in the world so that everyone receives vaccines without discrimination. I mean, one could say that bodies like CEPI and Gavi and COVAX are doing that, but Seth, is there more scope for doing what the questioner asks?
Well, first of all, I think we'd have to be careful, because where would we geographically locate that? If we had the largest vaccine manufacturer in India, it ultimately had to bow to dealing with local supply. We have a lot of the science and technology in the US. They were in a place where they were focused on local issues and not global issues. So I think one of the challenges, and this gets to the governance question, is how do we get people to focus outward when there's an internal crisis? And I can't say from the beginning, we've said in a global pandemic, you're only safe unless everyone's safe, but people didn't believe it. People thought, I need to take care of my family, my community, my country, whatever you want to have there. And why are we talking about anybody else? And then when the new variants appeared, which we haven't talked a lot about, and began to pop up and move around the world, all of a sudden people were like, oh, we need to do something about this. And so I think for me, it is really about having a governance system that is able to be flexible and adaptable and changeable. So we are actually not an organization, we're an alliance. And what that means is that CEPI plays a role, and UNICEF plays a role, and WHO plays a role, and the World Bank plays a role, and that can expand and adjust as is needed, depending upon what's going on. To me, that is the way we think about going forward, is a networked solution, but we have to have enough global nodes so that if we do have nationalistic tendencies, that it doesn't squash the whole effort. That's really the thing we have to worry about. And we also need to change, the way the world thinks about these things going forward, given what Martin said with global warming and all the changes. We are going to see more potential pandemics. I agree with him that they don't have to be pandemics, but some of them will be. And then we need to make sure that we're prepared to deal with them on a global basis.
Thank you, Seth. We've only got another minute. I'm just going to put something briefly to Ugur. This person says, to you specifically, the world owes you a huge vote of thanks. How flexible and adaptable is your technology to quickly tackle future virus pandemics? mRNA, he means, of course. Ugur, last word.
Yeah, the messenger RNA comes, of course, with fast adaptability. The beauty of the technology is that you can, if you know really the target antigen, you take this piece of information, encode it as mRNA, put it into a lipid nanoparticle, and you have a vaccine. Yeah, and so that means we have, of course, to be lucky that the pathogen, which is in future emerging, is amenable for vaccine responses. So we can't exclude that the next pathogen is like more hepatitis C or like HIV, where over 30 years of research did not come up with a suitable vaccine because the pathogen is way too smart. Yeah. So that means if it's a pathogen which is in principle amenable for vaccines, I believe mRNA can do it.
Thank you. That's a great last note. Sadly, that is all we have time for. There were a lot of issues we didn't have time to talk about, but I want to give the most enthusiastic thanks to my panelists for their great interactions and great answers. I've enjoyed it enormously. Thanks to my colleagues on FT Live for organizing the session so capably. They've asked me to remind all of you that all Global Boardroom sessions will be available on the Global Boardroom website if you want to listen in the future. And with that, sadly, I have to return to Andrew in the FT studio. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clive.
Bye-bye.